Welcome, everybody. Despite what that clock says, it's actually 10 o'clock. So welcome to this Meet the Author session with Greg Lukianoff, who's on my right. I'm Dennis Hayes, the Director of Academics for Academic Freedom, and I'm really pleased to welcome Greg here, because FIRE are one of the partners for the battle and supporting several of the strands. And Greg, as you know, is the CEO and President of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. So we're really delighted to have him over from the USA. He promised me he won't go to sleep. It's empty.
I've been up since 1 a.m. with jet lag. That's what the joke is. So I'm punchy.
He's very well known as the author of The Coddling of the American Mind with Jonathan Haidt. And, of course, what we're here to discuss, The Cancelling of the American Mind with one L, which he wrote with Ricky Schott, who's a journalist and a former employee, of course.
She was a fellow. I started working with her when she was 20 because she's a freaking genius.
Right. Well, I've asked Greg to say a little bit about FIRE when he starts his talk. And how we're going to do this, Greg will speak for about 10 minutes. And then I've got 2 or 3 questions maximum. And then it's over to you for your questions and comments. And we will finish at 10:44, so you can all rush down to the bookshop and buy a copy of Greg's book and have it signed. So, Greg.
By me.
I just have one story I'm going to tell you. But in 2022, I sent in the proofs for a chapter in the Elgar Handbook on Academic Freedom, and my chapter was on campaigning groups. Mm-hmm. And it was all about FIRE, which was then the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. So as the proofs went in, Greg announced that they changed their name and their remit, right? And I nearly had a heart attack, I tell you. So I managed to get it changed and add a little bit of, actually, a quote from you about why it had changed. So that's the old FIRE, which was a very impressive organisation, but now it's bigger and better and bolder and led by Greg. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It's really excellent to be here. Really glad to be able to co-sponsor the Battle of Ideas this year. Actually, how many people in the audience know about what FIRE is? Almost everybody. That's fantastic. So FIRE turned 25 this year. We were founded in 1999. And I've been with FIRE since 2001. I was the weird law student who wanted to do freedom of speech for my career. I took every class that Stanford Law School offered on First Amendment. When I ran out of those, I did an internship at the ACLU of Northern California. And I did 6 credits of my own design, and this Brits will appreciate this, on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. Which I was just so thrilled about. And I remember telling like a friend, and he was like, "Who's making you do that?" I was like, "It's my own design." So this is what I wanted to do with my life, and I got scoffed at a little bit for seeking this out. And then when I started at FIRE, there were just 5 of us. And it seemed kind of crazy for me to turn down, these fancy jobs at law firms to go to this little unheard of organization. But very early on, when we had really unsympathetic cases, like right after 9/11, which was right when I started, we had a situation where there was a professor who was accused of actually having ties to terrorism. But they fired him because of a unpleasant speech he'd given in the 1980s. So they're like, no, we're going to ignore the terrorism part. We're just going to focus on those nasty words he said in 1989, in 2001. And we're like, okay, well, we're fighting you then. Like we're fighting this out in the court of public opinion. We're taking on Bill O'Reilly at Fox News. We're going to be the most unpopular group in the organization. And we were so in the country, and we were so small at the time. It was pretty clear that this could mean the end of FIRE. And that is when FIRE's secret motto, which has always been the secret motto of FIRE, but I'm only letting people know what it actually is now, because it sounds a little crazy. It's, well, we're willing to drive this bus into a wall. Really inspiring. But the weird thing is, for the staff, it really is super inspiring, because they're like, we'd rather drive this bus into a wall rather than be unprincipled. They love it. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly who I want working for me. So if I wanted FIRE to be a $100 million organization, I could have made it a $100 million organization 15 years ago by attacking hard right or hard left. That's how you make the money. The much harder way is to actually be willing to anger the right and the left, as long as these are people who don't fully understand freedom of speech belongs to everybody or it belongs to nobody. And so we've been able to attract the right people around us. Donors don't ask us to, pick and choose favorites. They know that they're wasting their time talking to us, and we'll just kind of look down on them after that if they ask. So I've put together this. We've put together this absolutely amazing team at FIRE. But originally we were focused just in higher education, as Dennis mentioned, and people were asking me for years and years, like, when will I grow FIRE beyond higher education? Now, of course, the silliest argument was, oh, everything will be fine in academia in a couple of years, and you can just move on. And I was like, oh, that's cute. That's not going to happen. But what I did think of is maybe we'd get big enough that we could do a couple things. One, try to help out at least a little bit almost everybody who writes us, and try to actually help out professors and students. Sometimes it's just referring them over to another organization is the most we can do. Sometimes it's taking their case and litigating it. And once we reached that stage, the other thing I wanted was to have a proper research department, which, by the way, the popularity of coddling the American mind was basically my proof of concept that, the constitutional lawyer who just kind of pretends to be a social psychologist, isn't enough for the team. We need actually a research department. And to be able to do a really rigorous ranking on how good schools are for their commitment to freedom of speech. And we've been doing that for several years now, improving our methodology. And just, how many people are familiar with who came in last year? Shout out the name of that unknown school.
Harvard.
Very obscure. 2 years in a row, they've come in dead last. And it's kind of funny, Randy Kennedy, who's kind of a friend at Harvard, is one of the many people who claim this is a stunt. And I'm like, sorry, Randy. You guys earned it. You guys got a negative 10.69 the first year. It was the first negative score anyone got on the on the FIRE ranking in our history. And last year they outdid themselves by getting a negative 20. So they've really been overachieving there. They do seem to want to mend their ways. So anyway, once we could actually do a comprehensive ranking, that's when I was open to the idea that we could extend beyond campus, that we could take on, we realized we couldn't save free speech in the United States without saving it on campus, but we started to worry that we couldn't save it on campus without saving it in the rest of the United States. So we were thinking about expanding. Maybe we'd consider this in our 25th year, which is this year. But what happened then? 2020 was the scariest year for academic freedom and for free speech I'd seen in my lifetime. The major newspaper founders of major magazines stepping down because they said something slightly un-PC. There was like 6 of them in the course of just a couple of weeks. More professors, targeted than we would ever see. That we saw as many professors targeted for being fired in just June and July of 2020 as we used to see in an entire year and then some in 2020. And the idea of free speech really seemed to be on retreat. So we decided we got to speed this up. So finally, in 2022, we became the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and we now do about 40% of our work is off campus. We haven't quite gotten to 50-50 off campus, because no sooner, like in Godfather 3, had we tried to get off campus, they pull you back in. And all of the craziness since October 7th has just required us to really, spend a lot of time explaining to people, yes, you can chant from the river to the sea. That's absolutely protected speech. No, you cannot take over buildings. You don't have an unlimited right to set up encampments on your. And by the way, if you are the students, who are rushing speeches, smashing windows, and scaring off speakers, you should actually be expelled, because you are actually a threat to academic freedom and free speech on your campus. So we were very busy over the last year. So why on earth am I in England? Sorry, Britain. Well, one, my mom's from here. She's actually from Carshalton, and I spent a lot of time here as a kid. But so it's dear to me to come back. But one thing that I do want to do more of is I don't believe we can keep speech free in the United States while doing this stupid American thing of being like, well, we believe in freedom of speech over here, but you Europeans, your hate speech codes and your national security codes and your misinformation codes and your right to be forgotten, they work just fine for you. No, they don't. And what is required is for us to be able to make the argument universally, to be able to say these are bad ideas for any society. And I can see the following ways in which it's hurting your society, sorry, Britain, and in the European Union. But to do that, we need more information. We need to know more people on the ground in Europe to figure out what the real story is. So are we, then the next question always becomes, so FIRE is going to be taking cases in the UK? No. We're not that big yet. Maybe when we're a $500 million organization like the ACLU, we could do something like that. But in the meantime, I do want to learn more from my good friends and family over here.
You got lots of smiles when you mentioned Carl Shelton. I don't know why. So, when I read the book, I've got a couple of contextual questions, rather directly. You start with the case of Hamline University, where an academic showed a painting of Muhammad.
Yeah, I think you got to get closer to your
microphone.
Showed
a picture of Muhammad to her students and was eventually cancelled.
Yeah.
But then I read your chapter on publishing and about people cancelling publishing. And then the question that raised in my mind was about the fatwa against Salman Rushdie.
Oh, sure.
On the 14th of February. Because here, last Wednesday was the 4th anniversary of the beheading of Samuel Paty, which every university and every teacher union in Britain ignored. Yeah. It was only the Free Speech Union and us who actually mentioned it. And we've got a teacher in hiding from death threats in Batley. So I just wondered why you didn't contextualise more or say more about Rushdie, because as you were writing the book, he was stabbed on stage. So isn't there a political dimension as well?
I always think of Salman Rushdie in terms of him not making it into the book. Honestly, there comes a stage where you just have to hand the damn thing in, and there are all sorts of additional things I could have put in it. But Rushdie was actually, he was our speaker at our 20th anniversary bash back in 2019. So I'm a huge fan of his. And I actually thought also in the States, the attack on Rushdie didn't get, as far as I was concerned, anywhere near the kind of coverage that it needed to. But so much of this whole movement, so much of the people who inspire me, including my now good friend Jonathan Rauch, came out of the Rushdie fatwa and the embarrassing behavior by the West, even back then, in not forcefully coming to his defense, being more apologetic about, oh, well, fine, we don't have blasphemy laws over here, but you do there, and that's your wonderful thing, and that's part of my point here, is that it's kind of like, no, I actually don't believe there should be blasphemy laws anywhere.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, keep in mind, that's a should. I'm not saying that someone should go out and impose this, but I think in the idea of a free world, it would mean your conscience is up to you. What you believe is up to you. It cannot be coerced by force. It cannot be coerced by the threat of physical harm or death. And I think that, but the stabbing of Salman Rushdie the fatwa against Salman Rushdie was what led to kindly inquisitors, which led to some real examinations from some really great minds of what was happening to the West's commitment to freedom of speech. And it was starting to run into this ideological mindset that had arisen largely on college campuses, which has all sorts of short-sightedness and silliness.
Second question is about, you talk about emotional reasoning and the infantilization of students. And I just wondered what you thought. You never actually used the term therapy culture.
Yeah.
Because there's Nolan's The Therapeutic State. It's a very influential book in America. And The Triumph of the Therapeutic came out in 1966, and I've written about it. So what do you think about the concept of therapy culture as being an issue?
Yeah, obviously that's what I was getting at. I guess I kind of got to it not having read a lot of those books. I got to it from a very personal direction. I don't know how many people remember this part. Raise your hands if you've read Coddling in the American Mind. Okay, so maybe a little bit less than half of you. Okay, so I'm going to tell a story that a lot of you don't know. Coddling in the American Mind came out of my suicidal depression in 2007. It came out of me being alone and just with my staff, essentially, in the culture war. Having a girlfriend, want to break up with me because I defended Republicans. I remember actually saying to her, I was quite in love with her too. I remember saying to her, I met her actually at a Buddhist retreat, that I believe that Nazis have free speech rights. I certainly believe Republicans do. And she actually said, I think Republicans might be worse. Yeah, the heart's a fickle thing, so that didn't quite work out. But at the same time, also a couple times, like nearly getting in fistfights with conservatives who didn't like the fact that we defended, radical leftists as well, and twice actually. It was weird. Got in a weird match with an American trying to tell me, someone whose grandfather fought the Bolsheviks in Russia, that his family from Kansas had lost more to the communists than we had. It's like, okay, that's fascinating. But it was a really ugly period. And at the end of it, after really the worst year of my life, I got so depressed, I tried to kill myself. I went to the hardware store to find the materials to do that. And I had this little flash of, what am I doing? And that got me to call 911, and I got myself checked in. And as I was recovering, I was studying this thing called cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, how many people know about cognitive behavioral therapy? I'm enjoying this participation part. This is actually very fun for me. Okay, good, most of you. So cognitive behavioral therapy is this amazing insight that essentially, for those of us who have issues with anxiety and depression, actually, to be honest, all of us, to a degree, tend to have distorted thoughts, tend to have mental exaggerations, things like emotional reasoning, where you feel something and we can't believe that we're just feeling it for some reason we don't entirely understand. You have this, something must be done about this feeling of dread that I have because something real must be happening. There's catastrophizing, of course, like the idea that if something slightly goes wrong, you're going to die alone or something like that. There's binary thinking. Everything is either 0 or 1. The other things are terrible or great. And I was learning to talk back to this in my own mind. And it really saved my life. It really made me. It got me over my years and years of anxiety and depression. But I was watching what was going on campus because I was already defending free speech on campus, and being like, why are the adults modeling cognitive distortions for young people? Like, why are they actually basically saying, you really should catastrophize? Emotional reasoning sounds great. They were really modeling this behavior. But in 2008, the answer was at least the adults weren't buying it. The kids weren't buying it. They were rolling their eyes at the adults like they always had. But in 2013, that all changed. Right at the end of 2013, particularly going into 2014, students were showing up, medicalizing normal interactions in life, and making arguments that older students would make about censorship, but this time making them from a medicalized standpoint, not that bastard can't speak on my campus because he's a bigot. It's that bastard can't speak on my campus because he would be medically traumatizing to people, usually not me, like some other constituency at the school, and therefore has to be stopped in the name of mental health. And I realized immediately that this was what I'd been afraid of for years. And I talked to my friend John Haidt in 2014 and was just like, listen, this is going to be a disaster both for mental health and for freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus if this goes forward. And unfortunately, and this was before the data was in, but my goodness, it was so much worse than either Haidt and I thought was going to be, both for mental health and for academic freedom and freedom of speech. So basically the answer is I believe in therapy culture just partially because I got there a different way. I didn't use the same vocabulary.
There's a very good book called The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education.
Okay.
I wrote it. So.
Oh, I was just about to ask, who wrote it? Do tell.
Just one of the really impressive thing about this book is it's full of examples and examples of cancelling that really a third of the book, nearly 100 pages, are on solutions. Now, you often get books that say there's this big problem at the end, we must do something about it. But there's a lot of suggestions of what you can do about it. In particular, I really like the suggestion that you've got to build up a free speech culture.
Yeah.
So would you say something about what a free speech culture is?
Yeah, no, it was kind of funny. There was this weird debate that I couldn't believe I even had to have in the United States about whether or not free speech culture even exists. And it was with this legal expert that I often agree with, but often don't, and increasingly don't. But he was claiming that free speech culture just is an incoherent argument, and the only thing that really matters is free speech law. And it's like, dude, we're in a common law country. Like, where do you think our law comes from? It's influence, it's a product of our culture. So in a very real sense, our cultural ideas of freedom of speech in a common law country, actually really for any country that produces its own laws, which I guess is everywhere, your culture matters. And so the cultural ideas of freedom of speech, of course, led to the First Amendment. Cultural ideas of separation of powers led to our Constitution. And then people will ask me kind of like, well, what's the parameters of that? And then I pivot a little bit back to First Amendment being, and I'm very sort of chauvinistic about this, and I love doing this in front of European audiences, is the 100 years, more than 100 years at this point, of some of the brightest minds in the United States trying to figure out how you have freedom of speech in the real world. And despite people thinking, I think I get this from Europeans, and to borrow a technical legal term, think the American law is batshit in our commitment to freedom of speech, we actually have very sensible rules around it. And it includes things like the heart of darkness is viewpoint discrimination, that essentially saying that everyone can talk except you with that opinion. Like, that's basically the definition of censorship. It has very sensible ideas about what is and isn't protected and what parameters you can use. And I think one of the ones that I think is one of the major distinguishing points between American and British law, which and European law, is that you can't factor in offensiveness. You can't ban something just because it's offensive in the United States. And that's the right rule for a genuinely diverse, genuinely multicultural society. And I think that Europe would actually benefit from this idea quite a bit too. But all these other horror stories I get from Europeans, I'm like, no, now you're talking about incitement, now you're talking about threats, now you're talking about actual harassment, you're talking about patterns of behavior in some cases, or things that aren't protected anywhere, nor should they be. So a lot of my ideas on free speech culture actually are well reflected in free speech laws. But when I come to so how do you distill some of these norms? I have to remind people that, and I feel very lucky to have grown up in the 80s and 90s. Because it was a time when, the small L liberalism of the West was getting more confident as we were watching the failure of what was happening, in the East. We were watching all of these ideas of a totalitarian utopia kind of fall apart. And during that time, it was very normal, and for probably most of American history, for people just to say, as cliches that we all agreed were true, things like, it's a free country, to each their own, everyone's entitled to their opinion. All of these little devices that we had, all these little idioms, all these little sayings, to actually remind you to check yourself and to not judge a book by its cover, for example, that my younger author, Ricky Schlott, who I mentioned before, she didn't hear these things growing up. And I have to remind people, something as simple as everyone's entitled to their opinion, sometimes said with gritted teeth, is actually one of the most important things you need to bring people back to.
Over to you for questions, please. You know the ropes. We've got 2 mics. A hand at the back there. Sorry. And would you come to the front? There's lots of hands here. Lady with a hand up.
Hi. Thank you, Greg. You said 2020 was a particularly bad year.
Yeah.
That was obviously the year of the COVID lockdowns.
Yep.
Was that kind of coincidental, or was there an impact, do you think, of that lockdown effect? Because I go 2 ways in sort of thinking about this.
We'll take a few questions. Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. Yeah.
Oh, hi. Thank you for your speech. As an American, I wondered what your take on incitement is. Myself, I do believe in free speech, but I'm always guided by John Stuart Mill. And I just wondered, as an American, how that works.
Incitement?
We'll take this little row here, people, and then...
Hi there. I'm from Scotland. I didn't bring my hate crime monster with me. I'm sorry, but I work for the Scottish Union for Education. We hear from a lot of parents who are concerned about literature that's getting into school libraries, which is highly pornographic. And I know this is an issue in America as well, and I'm wondering if you can comment on what are the boundaries, if indeed there are, in terms of free speech when it comes to what is allowable or acceptable in the context of what's available to children?
One more and then...
Hello. Firstly, thank you for everything you do. My question was, what gives people the motivation to make the effort to talk to people very different? So I think anyone can make that, but it is an effort. It does take some energy. So how do we make the connection between the benefits of talking with people who think differently from us and sort of overcome the inertia, the tribalism, sort of connect the longer-term benefits of having a more open debate and using that? I hope I'm making sense, like give people the motivation to get there.
Okay. So on 3 hours of sleep, that's such a strange way to do these questions, because it's kind of like I'm putting all into like a pot and stirring them and being like, well, okay, now let me see. COVID lockdowns and 2020. So COVID lockdowns drove everybody insane. It revealed the safetyism, that we talk about in Coddling the American Mind. It turned it up to 11. And also the death of George Floyd in the United States also caused a situation in which people were stuck at home and kind of losing their minds a little bit to have some shared horror, because the actual situation of the death of George Floyd was horrifying, and rightfully so. But I'm a civil libertarian, so when I saw that, I was like, oh, this will be an opportunity for us to pass 5 very sensible police reforms that will actually help keep stuff like this from happening. That really could have worked. Thinking like a good, member of a democratic republic about like what we could actually do to change the system. And instead, particularly on campus, it turned into, I'm going to get every professor who ever said anything I disliked fired. And I'm going to get my friends in high school, I'm going to get their acceptance to fancy schools revoked because they said the N-word one time in a Snapchat video. It was shameful, the extent to which people were just like, oh, this horrible thing happened, let's settle some old scores and get rid of some people we don't like for their opinion. So COVID, so incitement. Incitement is, in the United States, it's a tough standard to meet, but it's not unmeetable. Incitement in the United States is imminent lawless action. Basically, it's not just saying, I think the mayor's office should be burned down. It's saying that in a situation in which you're actually talking to people who might burn down the mayor's office, and that's your intention, is to actually, let's go freaking burn down the mayor's office. Don't go burn down the mayor's office, by the way. Although, actually, hold on, I have to, since I'm in a crowded theater, I just have to try this one thing. Fire! See?
They laugh.
Anyway, back to the incitement standard. So it has to be imminent lawless action. You have to have the intent to actually have caused it. So it's a tough standard in the United States, but it certainly isn't, I think these freaking people should be killed. That's a horrible thing to say, but it's something that's the kind of language that people have used every time they're angry for time immemorial. And I think that Britain has kind of lost the plot on what the definition of incitement is. Next, standards for libraries. So the library issue is one of those ones that I feel like has been pretty dishonestly argued about in the United States. I feel like FIRE has really been trying to be a voice of reason on this. We have definitely seen, so there's a great case called PICO from 1983, which basically said, it's a little bit of a weird decision. It more or less says, the Supreme Court says that you can have public school libraries, and you can have books, librarians and local people can decide like what books go into them, but people can't decide to take books out just on the basis of a dislike of the political viewpoint in them. honestly, it was a per curiam. It was a mixed decision back then. It's not one that I believe would be upheld by the Supreme Court now, but I think it actually stands for a relatively sensible idea. That essentially, if your only motivation is just getting rid of a particular point of view, that's troubling from a constitutional standpoint, and it should be, and from a principled standpoint. So when it comes to cases where you see schools, removing books because they don't like the point of view, that's one thing. But there's a couple powers that schools and parents associations and all these other groups actually do have that they have to exercise, which is it appropriate for kids? Is it something that, a 7-year-old could understand? Is it something that's too sexually explicit for a 7-year-old? And the best you can do in that case is argue for a sensible structure that doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't just let education school graduates decide what's appropriate, because that will be incredibly slanted. Having parents involved, and that's what we've more or less called it due process for books. But in the course of watching this debate in the United States, having people say they're just going after books with LGBTQ themes, and I'm like, have you read some of these books? I mean, there's one called Let's Talk About It that literally has, take a look at it. It's literally pictures of how you put butt plugs in, really graphic ones, showing the whole business. And every page is like that, and it's kind of okay, you should probably mention that when you're actually talking about that, just so you treat your audience like they're adults. So I do think that some of the argument about cases not making the distinction between situations in which some parent can reasonably say this is not appropriate for my 7-year-old should be taken a bit more seriously. And then the last one, how do you get people motivated? That's something that the desire to actually want to talk across a line of difference is something that we are heavily discouraging at the moment. And so it's an excellent question and something that we really must think about. I do, however, think that there's a personality type that is naturally drawn to this and is going to more easily be excited about situations in which they can actually talk across lines of difference. Well, so you have to remove impediments to that. There's a software program, I think, called Sway that has some exciting ramifications that actually uses AI to facilitate discussions between people who disagree. I see real potential in that kind of thinking. But you have to have it as a cultural value. And one thing that is really essential is if you're being educated in a situation that's saying, we believe in justice and equity and fairness, and by the way, 90% of the rest of the population are moral monsters. That's not the way you want to start a democratic society.
We do have debating matters that the Academy of Ideas runs, which actually fosters debate in schools throughout Britain, which is a very fantastic initiative. So I've got the man in black here, and the man in blue in the middle, and then we'll walk back. Don't worry, everybody's getting really agitated, trying to take as many as possible.
I'd like to pick up on that remark about AI, actually, and ask about AI-generated speech.
Yes.
Now, part of me thinks that if people can't be bothered to make their own words, they've already ceded control of those words, and they haven't got much ground to stand on. That's an unsympathetic bit of me. But I thought it was very interesting. OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, published their system card last year, which explained their guardrails, how they work out preventing harm, including what they call harms of representation.
Yeah.
And they seem to treat, in that document, things like, causing death and destruction with guns, poison, and bombs as of a piece with, for example, perpetuating heteronormativity.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in your thoughts on the speech
Basically
status of AI-generated words and how the guardrails get put on them and how that relates to free speech culture.
Yeah. Sandy?
Yeah, so my question is also about free speech culture. So in the last chapter of your book with Ricky Schlott, you make a powerful case for free speech culture, and you have some excellent suggestions about how one can create free speech culture. And when I was reading it, I was thinking that traditionally a driver for free speech culture has been the youth, and youth will perhaps naturally rebel against constraining establishment. So I wonder if there is a silver lining in the cancel culture and the safetyism that we are seeing, and if you think we should expect a countercultural revolution in the near future.
There's loads of people who want to speak, so... sorry, I promised you. And then the man with his hands up way at the back there.
Thank you. Hi, yeah. My name is William, and I just want to say first, I come from a debate club called 104 London Debaters. We have a stand in the main hall, and we do like to engender conversations between people who disagree. So do please come to our meetings. So a bit of a complicated question, Greg. So in a free society with freedom of expression, shouldn't also organizations have the right to discriminate against and censor certain opinions they don't like, if they are privately owned in particular? So companies, including social media companies, because I see a danger that in our eagerness to promote freedom of speech, we increase the size and the power of the state to compel companies and private organizations to accept opinions they don't want to accept. So I'm wondering on your thoughts on that.
Congratulations. Fire's really inspired me, and I think many people, and your film, particularly The Mighty Ira, I think should be compulsory viewing for particularly younger people. We should all circulate it in Britain if anyone hasn't seen it. It's remarkable.
And the creator of it, Nico Perino's right there.
Yeah, bravo. I suppose my question is this. We've seen things like Batley Grammar and then Yorkshire Police saying, yeah, well, we've made mistakes, we'll take it on board. But at the same time, things like the Digital Services Act in Europe and the Online Safety Act here, and also very particular type of speech or ideas being targeted. And also linked now with this idea of incitement to harm, words and actions being converged almost. How much do you think we're winning the battle? In America, for instance, when things like Columbia University's cops with rifles, Seattle police stations being burnt down, that thing where people think words are actions, words harm people, and we don't need to speak anymore, we might actually just do physical acts. How well do you think we're doing in America? And what are your thoughts just on Britain and where we're at with Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper's comments?
I'm going to take two more and then come back. You don't have to answer all the questions.
Whoa.
Just let people speak.
Okay.
As you're on Turf Island, Joe Phoenix, do you want-
Hi, Joe Phoenix here. Thank you very much for your talk and the book, and also Coddling of the American Mind. I just wondered if you could make a few comments about how you see or how you think about the fight that many gender-critical people have had using the Equality Act and a particular protected belief in order to allow them to speak about gender-critical matters without facing discrimination.
Pass it to Heather next.
Yep, Heather McKee. I'm the convener for Student Academics for Academic Freedom. Please come to our stand. It's just by the Assembly Hall.
That's the advertising.
Yeah, exactly. Have to do it. So I'm a psychology student, and I'm really interested in what you were saying, Greg, around the therapy side of things, and looking at it from a coddling of the young mind, so the mental health crisis. Is there a mental health crisis, or are we causing it, as in terms of making everything an overdiagnosis of mental health or mental health disorders? And I wondered if, particularly in America, where Big Pharma controls so much and it's so much of a big business, what's your thoughts around trying to tackle that so that people aren't being overdiagnosed?
You've got 5 minutes. You don't have to answer.
Oh, I'm gonna
pick out one or two.
Okay, so AI. As far as like the place where fire needs to grow the most is in tech. I'm a tech nerd. A lot of us First Amendment people are tech nerd, but we need to be even tech nerdier, because I actually see huge hope and promise in AI, but we need to protect OpenAI as much as we can. Because what my biggest fear, and freedom of speech, this is something I think is obvious, but it bears saying, freedom of speech is inextricably linked with the production of knowledge. You cannot have accurate knowledge production without freedom of speech. And essentially academic freedom is freedom of speech with parameters, just the same way that the scientific method is freedom of speech with different parameters. Now my fear is that what's going on, and I testified about this in Congress, back in February, that essentially the play on Capitol Hill is to scare the living bejesus out of everybody on Capitol Hill, and that's where I live. To get them so scared of AI that they basically create a situation that will allow only a handful of companies to dominate the space for AI. And that poses the problem that the graduates of Stanford, for example, in Silicon Valley, would be the same people deciding what objective truth is now and forever. And that should scare you all to death, because academia has become an increasingly unreliable source of accurate information when it relates to anything with political valence whatsoever. And actually, frankly, what comes to the replication crisis, a decided number of other topics. So I definitely think that you need to harness AI to point out, it's fully capable of pointing out how much of our scholarship is weak or plagiarized. Like, it could be a real boon for free speech and the production of knowledge, but we just have to, think about it more intelligently and not let that oligopoly to happen. Now, the question about whether or not we care about the free speech rights of the companies, of the social media companies, to decide what opinions they will and will not allow, and this might not be a very popular argument in this crowd, but absolutely. I am much more afraid of the government having power to require social media companies to say, well, you have to allow the following opinions, than those companies having those opinions. And this, I feel like we went through a brief shining moment when the argument that, Twitter controls the public square felt like a really compelling argument, but then Musk takes over, and then a lot of the people go to Bluesky, and they go to Threads, and it was like, oh, I guess you weren't actually forced to be on Twitter, it turns out. And we're realizing how thin of an idea we nearly actually gave government the power to start going into that much more deeply. There's a question about whether or not we're winning in the United States or in Britain. My biggest fear is that people are starting to think we're winning because we're not quite as crazy as we were in 2020 and 21, and that's an illusion. I also have bad news for Britain. You guys have gotten way too used to like the idea that people kind of shrug their shoulders a little bit about the fact that people go to jail here for what they say. That's insane. And you should not be used to that, and you should not tolerate that, because and this is one of the advantages of my mom being from Carshalton, well, actually Wallington, is that I've seen what's happened over here. You Brits used to laugh at us, appropriately so, for our ridiculous political correctness, and I'd smoke my cigarettes and drink my pints with my friends and crack dirty jokes, here while you guys laughed at us about how PC we are. Man, you guys outdid us. Like, you just sprinted right past us in this terrible, terrible race. So congratulations.
On that happy note, we have to stop. Thank you for coming. Two things. Go and buy the book and get it signed by Greg, and then visit the AFAF stall and sign the AFAF statement if you haven't. So thank you all for your questions, and sorry we didn't take them all.